The galactic conclave had existed for 11,000 years before humanity found its signal. 43 species, 17 star systems, one governing body, and a unanimous, unbroken policy of quarantine regarding the third planet of a yellow dwarf in the Orion Arm. The species there were, in the clinical language of the conclave's xenobiological registry, pre-ascendant primitives exhibiting high-frequency intraspecific violence. They were to be observed, never contacted, certainly never armed. The conclave had been watching for 600 years by the time humanity lit its first atomic fires. They watched the wars that followed, the ones counted in megatons and millions. They cataloged the treaties, the broken promises, the slow crawl towards something resembling cooperation. They noted with something approaching scientific satisfaction that the humans had not, in fact, destroyed themselves. But they were not impressed. Species pulled back from the edge all the time. It proved restraint. It did not prove readiness. So when the human vessel Antikythera dropped out of faster-than-light travel inside conclave sovereign space in the year 2201, the response was not alarm. It was bureaucratic irritation. A border patrol was dispatched. The humans were to be assessed, cataloged, and quietly turned around. They were primitives who had gotten lucky with physics. Nothing more. The patrol commander, a Veth elder named Sueris, whose species communicated in layered harmonics and had not fought a war in 3,000 years, broadcast the standard quarantine notification on all frequencies. The human captain's response came back in imperfect but comprehensible galactic standard, which was itself alarming, since no one had taught them the language. They had reverse-engineered it from intercepted conclave communications in approximately 4 years. The captain said, "We are humanity. We come in peace. We would very much like to talk." Sueris noted the phrasing, "in peace," as though they were aware that other options existed. She allowed the meeting. She had read the reports, of course. The xenobiological files were thorough. She knew the humans were bilaterally symmetrical, soft-bodied, absurdly fragile by galactic standards. No natural armor, no venom, no echolocation, no collective cognition, no electromagnetic sense. Gravity-dependent, temperature-sensitive. They required constant liquid intake or they began to malfunction within days. And yet, the captain who came aboard was a woman named Admiral Yara Osemensa, and the moment Sueris saw her walk through the docking corridor, something ancient and instinctual in the Veth nervous system said, "Careful." It was not anything the Admiral did. She was courteous, precise, and carried a small gift. A bottle of something amber-colored that she explained was a distilled grain spirit from a place called Scotland, offered as a gesture of goodwill between explorers. She smiled often. Her eyes moved constantly, cataloging everything in the room with the quiet efficiency of something that had been hunting for a very long time. Sueris had studied 1,000 species. She had met apex predators before. The Grawl were 8 meters tall and had 6 limbs designed for rending. The Kavith could reshape their own biology in minutes. But none of them had ever walked into a room full of unknowns and immediately started looking for the exits while simultaneously offering a gift and asking about your children. "You evolved on a high-competition world," Sueris said, during a pause in negotiations. "We did," said Admiral Osemensa, without any apparent offense. "It was a very crowded planet. Lots of things wanted to eat us. And now nothing does." The Admiral smiled. It was a complicated expression. Nothing tries twice. The meeting lasted 9 hours. By the end, Sueris had filed an urgent report to the Conclave High Assembly flagged at the maximum priority level she was authorized to use. The subject line reads simply, "We have a problem. Humanity did not start the war." This is important, and it is the part that the history texts of a dozen species quietly omit. The Drexy started it. The Drexy were the Conclave's enforcers, a species of colonial intelligence, not a hive mind exactly, but something close, a distributed consciousness that experienced individual death the way a human might experience the loss of a fingernail. They had been policing the outer territories for 2,000 years. They were very good at it. They had never encountered a species that did not, when presented with sufficient force, comply. When the Conclave's High Assembly voted to issue humanity a formal expulsion from galactic space, to be enforced with whatever means necessary, the Drexy were sent to deliver the message. They glassed a human colony on Kepler 442b. 40,000 people. Gone in 11 minutes. A demonstration, the Drexy colonial mind reasoned. An efficient one. The humans would understand the math. They did not understand it the way the Drexy expected. There is an old Veth philosophical concept. Suarez had studied it in school, dusty and academic, called the paradox of the wounded predator. The idea is simple. A healthy predator is dangerous. A wounded one is something else entirely. It has nothing left to lose, intimate knowledge of pain, and a very specific relationship with mortality that removes the usual inhibitions. Humanity had spent 10,000 years being wounded. By their environment, by each other, by disease and famine and catastrophic weather, and the slow existential weight of knowing they would die and that the universe did not care. They had built their entire civilization on a foundation of shared loss. And out of that loss they had constructed medicine, art, law, love, and an absolutely terrifying capacity for organized violence in defense of things they considered sacred. The Drexy had killed 40,000 people. Every single human alive knew someone on that colony. It was a small species still. They were all, in some way, family. Earth's response took 72 hours to organize, which the conclave found baffling, assuming this meant the primitives were slow. And then it came all at once. Not one fleet. Dozens. Assembled from commercial freighters refitted in orbital dry docks, from asteroid mining platforms repurposed as rail cannons, from every scrap of military hardware Earth and its colonies had produced in 2 centuries of quiet, patient preparation. Because humanity had read the signals. They had known this conversation was coming. They had hoped it wouldn't. They had prepared anyway. The Drexy colonial mind, assessing the approaching force, transmitted a single message to the Conclave High Assembly. Recalculate. The Conclave had records of 10,000 wars. They had seen every strategy the galaxy could produce. Set-piece battles between armored leviathans, precision strikes, attrition campaigns, siege economics, psychological operations, biological weapons, before those were banned. They had never seen anything like this. Human warfare doctrine, as it turned out, was the product of 10 millennia of fighting each other. Every trick, every counter, every feint and flanking maneuver and tactical deception had been tested against opponents who were also human, which meant opponents who were just as clever, just as adaptive, just as willing to die for what they believed in. Humanity had spent thousands of years sharpening itself against itself, and the resulting edge was something the galaxy had no framework for. They were patient in ways that seemed insane. A human commander would accept losses that would cause most species to retreat, hold a position for weeks, bleed, and wait, because she understood that the enemy would eventually make a mistake, and she intended to be alive when they did. They were also, when the moment came, catastrophically fast. The Drexy had processing speeds that dwarfed human cognition. But the Drexy colonial mind thought in consensus. Every decision was distributed, evaluated, ratified. It took milliseconds by human standards, but in the compressed time of close combat, milliseconds were everything. A human pilot, alone in a cockpit, could decide and act in the space where the Drexy were still reaching agreement. And they communicated in ways no one had anticipated. Not just language, though they were alarmingly good with language, but gesture, expression, implication, tone. A human commander could convey a complete tactical revision to her crew with a look. They had spent so long reading each other that they had developed a kind of shorthand that was almost telepathic. Within 6 months, the Drexy had lost a third of their operational fleet and 3 of their core colony worlds. They had killed, in that same period, approximately 200,000 humans. The humans mourned every single one. And they kept fighting. Suarez stood before the Conclave High Assembly, 43 species, the great and ancient powers of the galaxy, and said what no one wanted to hear. "We cannot win this war," she said. "Not as it is currently being fought." The Drexy representative, or rather the Drexy avatar, a constructed body through which the colonial mind spoke, objected. They had superior numbers, superior technology, superior processing capacity. "You have all of those things," Suarez agreed. "And you are losing." She laid out the mathematics. Attrition rates, fleet replacement timelines, colony fortification projections. The Conclave had assumed the humans would run out of ships. But humans didn't strip mine for resources the way the Conclave did. They recycled. They improvised. They built weapons out of what was available, and what was available kept growing because they were, underneath everything, brilliant engineers driven by a cultural terror of being helpless. Furthermore, she said, we are fighting them in a way that makes them stronger. She explained the paradox of the wounded predator. She explained what she had seen in Admiral Osaminsa's eyes, that specific quality of a species that has known suffering so intimately that it no longer fears it, only respects it. Every colony we destroy, she said quietly, we make them angrier. And they do not fight worse when they are angry. They fight better. They fight with a kind of ferocity that our models have no category for because it is not rational. It is not calculated. It is something older than calculation. The assembly was silent. They call it grief, she said. It is the feeling of loss transformed into purpose. Our species have largely evolved past it. We process death efficiently. We move on. They do not move on. They carry their dead with them, and the dead make them dangerous in a way that no amount of firepower can answer. She paused, and then she said the thing she had come to say. We should have talked to them. The ceasefire proposal was transmitted to the Human Fleet Command 6 months into the war. Admiral Osaminsa read it in her quarters on the carrier Accra, with the lights of a captured Drexy shipyard visible through the porthole. Her aide waited. Her senior staff waited. The entire human diplomatic corps held its breath. She sat with it for a very long time. Outside, in the ship's medical bay, 312 of her crew were being treated for injuries from the last engagement. 14 were in critical condition. 2 had died that morning. She knew both of their names. She knew their families. She had already drafted the letters. She thought about Kepler 442b. She thought about 40,000 people who never got letters, because there was no one left to write them and no one left to receive them. She thought about what her grandmother had told her, once, a very old woman who had survived things that should not be survived, who had come out the other side not bitter but clear-eyed in a way that sometimes frightened people. Her grandmother had said, the purpose of surviving is not to prove that you deserve to. It is to make sure the next ones don't have to. She transmitted her response. Yes, but there will be conditions. The negotiations lasted 2 years. Suarez led the conclave delegation. Admiral Osaminsa led the human one. They were, by the end, something that neither of them would have called friends exactly, but something more honest than that. 2 people who had looked at each other clearly, in full knowledge of what the other was capable of, and chosen to be in the same room anyway. Humanity's conditions were not what the conclave expected. There were no demands for territory, no reparations beyond the symbolic, no requests for technology transfers or trade monopolies. The first condition was this: the quarantine policy would end. Permanently. Every pre-contact species in the galaxy would receive the same rights as every other. They would be observed, yes, but they would also be known, and when they were ready, they would be welcomed. The second condition: the conclave would establish a war crimes tribunal with actual enforcement power, something it had never had, and that tribunal would be co-administered with human legal scholars for the first 50 years, because human civilization had spent centuries figuring out how to hold power accountable, and they were, bluntly, better at it. The third condition was the one that silenced the room. The humans wanted to send doctors, not to their own worlds, to Drexy colony planets, where the war had caused famines and infrastructure collapse. They wanted to send physicians, engineers, agricultural specialists, trauma counselors, to the species that had killed 200,000 of them. The Drexy avatar sat very still for a long moment. Why? It finally asked. Admiral Osaminsa looked at it steadily. Because they're suffering. And because what we do after a war matters as much as how we fight one. Maybe more. They killed your people. Yes, she said. And if we leave their people to die of preventable causes, we will have become something we don't want to be. She paused. We've made that mistake before. We know what it costs. Suarez, sitting to the side, wrote nothing in her notes. She simply watched and understood that she had been wrong about these creatures from the very beginning, in a specific and important way. She had seen the predator in them and thought that was the whole story. She had not understood that the same species that produced their capacity for war had also produced their capacity for medicine. That the instinct that made them carry their dead made them carry their wounded, too, even enemy wounded. That the grief she had identified as the source of their ferocity was also the source of their compassion, because both came from the same place. They felt things completely, and then they acted. They were not ruthless despite their kindness, or kind despite their ruthlessness. They were both, at full intensity, for the same reason. They were a species that had learned, over 10,000 years of hurting each other, that there were only two things worth doing with pain: ending it, or making sure it meant something. 20 years after the ceasefire, a Drexy colony world called Vashkorath had a human hospital at its center. It was staffed by rotating volunteers from 40 different Earth nations, and it treated approximately 12,000 patients a year. The Drexy colonial mind had, over time, allocated part of its distributed cognition to learning human diagnostic medicine, and human doctors had in turn learned things about the Drexy nervous system that changed their understanding of consciousness entirely. On the wall of the hospital's entrance hall there was a plaque. It had been put up by the Drexy themselves, which had surprised everyone. It was written in Galactic Standard, in human script, and in the Drexy's own bioluminescent notation system. It said, "They came here after the war. They did not have to. That is the point." Admiral Yara Oseminsa retired the year the hospital opened. She went back to Earth, to a house near the sea, and she planted a garden, and she spent a great deal of time sitting in it. She was not at peace exactly. She did not think you could be, fully, after certain things, but she was something more useful than peace. She was present. Sue Eris visited once, near the end of both their lives. They sat in the garden and did not talk about the war, and then they talked about nothing else, and then they sat quietly again, watching the water. "Do you think it was worth it?" Sue Eris asked. "The cost." Oseminsa was quiet for a long time. When she answered, it was not the answer of a diplomat or a general. It was the answer of an old woman who had spent 20 years trying to figure out what the answer was. "The cost was real," she said. "Every name on every list was real. I don't think you're allowed to say something like that was worth it. Worth implies a transaction. Those people weren't currency." She watched a wave come in. "But the world we built after, I think they'd have wanted that. I think they would have chosen it, if they'd been asked. So I try to make sure it deserves them." She paused. "That's the best I can do." Sue Eris thought about the Conclave's 11,000 years of careful, ordered, quarantined peace. All the species they had kept at arm's length, all the contact they had never made, all the grief they had never allowed themselves to feel. And she thought about this garden, and the hospital on Vashkorath, and the 43 diplomatic delegations that now included a 44th. "You are the strangest species I have ever encountered," she said. Oseminsa smiled. It was the same complicated smile from 20 years ago, in a docking corridor, with a bottle of Scottish whiskey. "We get that a lot," she said.